Hello and welcome back to another GiantSlayer TFT Synergies tier list video. Today our analysts are ranking each synergy from S all the way down to the C tier for set 5 PvE. This is an early look at where synergies are landing in the meta, but keep in mind set 5 is still receiving a lot of changes. While we're nearing the full release of the new set, there's still enough being tweaked that nothing is set in stone. That, coupled with everything being new, means you should take all of this with a grain of salt, as there's likely a lot of shifts that will happen over the course of the next few weeks. With all that said, let's get started. But before we begin, please don't forget to click the links in our description. Give your support to everyone who helped make this video happen. We host many TFT tournaments with plenty of exciting content to come. Be sure to also follow our GiantSlayerTV social media pages. Alright, let's get back to the video. Starting off, we have the synergies in S tier. This tier consists of Cavalier, Ironclad, Nightbringer, Forgotten, and Redeemed. These synergies are the current frontrunners of the set, meaning they're used often in a lot of compositions. At the top of S tier, we have Cavalier. Cavalier has proven itself to be the best potential frontline you can have in set 5, at least so far in the PvE. The damage reduction helps a lot in that regard, but it mostly comes down to the champions. All of them are good in their respective tiers, but Rel is by far the best and is a big reason for Cavalier doing as well as it is. Speaking of Rel, she's also part of the next synergy, Ironclad. Ironclad is simple and easy to splash in as it provides armor to your whole board for just 2 or 3 champions. It's basically the armor version of Mystic, and we all know how valuable Mystic can be as a splash trait. The difference is armor will reduce a lot more overall damage because auto attacks are almost always physical damage. Of course, the true reason we have Ironclad in the S tier is because of Rel. If you have Rel as part of your frontline, you can easily fit in another Cavalier and Ironclad, and boom, your frontline is strong. The next 3 traits are all about consistency throughout the game. The first one here is Nightbringer. The trait effective Nightbringer is useful, with the shield often keeping a champion alive once it dips below 50% health. But a large reason for Nightbringer's success is also the champions. Early on, you have Sejuani and Vladimir. Mid-game, you've got plenty of 3 costs to choose from, and then you have Aphelios as the main carry. Diana brings good utility, and in the late game, you've got Darius. Thus, it's easy to fit in Nightbringer at any stage of the game, and all of them bring a lot of value to your board. Next, we've got Forgotten. Forgotten has a lot of champions, 9 baseline, with the ability to add more in with the spatula. This means you can often find a way to fit in Forgotten throughout the game quite easily. And just having 3 Forgotten is a boon to the champion since they get increased attack damage and ability power, which you can then augment by having shadow items on them, and since a lot of shadow items are quite good, this pairing is always valuable. The main difference between Forgotten and Nightbringer is that Forgotten lacks frontline and crowd control. Sure, there's some with Thresh and Hecarim, and Ryze can CC, but Forgotten is more about damage with Vayne, Katarina, Draven, and Viego. This means it can be harder to toss in Forgotten if you're lacking CC or a frontline. And the last synergy in the S tier is Redeemed. Overall, Redeemed on its own isn't all that amazing, but there's a lot of strong Redeemed champions that redeem it. Early game, Leona is a solid frontline, Aatrox can both tank and do damage, and Syndra is useful all game for her CC. Rel is also redeemed, and you already know how much we like Rel in the frontline. And then there's Vel'Koz, who has gone up and down in balance, but is a solid DPS nonetheless, with Kayle holding down the late game fort. All in all, Redeemed isn't quite up to par with Forgotten or Nightbringer, but it's close enough in value to warrant a spot in the S tier. Let's now move on to the A tier. This tier consists of Knight, God King, Invoker, Ranger, Hellion, Legionnaire, Renewer, Eternal, and Revenant. The traits in A tier are not always as useful as S tier traits, but they're consistent and provide a lot of value on their own. Up first is Knight. Most of us should be familiar with the trait, as reducing incoming damage is pretty easy to understand. Knights are all about frontline, and being able to piece together a solid frontline is important for any composition. Thus, Knights have inherent value in the meta. Next up is God King. Honestly, God King as a trait is a bit underwhelming, at least the rival system that they have so far. This could easily change in the future, but for now the value of this trait rests entirely on the shoulders of Garen and Darius, both of which are strong late game frontliners that are hard to kill and do good damage. Invoker has proven to be one of the best splash traits so far in set 5. Giving increased mana to all allies is quite valuable, especially if you compare it to the flop that was enlightened in set 4. The only downside is most of the Invoker champions are expensive, so it can be hard to splash the trait in early. Ranger is one of the quintessential carry traits of the meta, with Aphelios being the poster boy of the trait. Vayne can carry if you reroll for Vayne 3, but if we're talking Rangers, it usually means Aphelios carry, and he does that role well. Ashe does bring much needed CC, but the other star of the Ranger show is Kindred with their literal life-saving ability. Moving along, we've got Hellion. Hellion is really about the synergy of the champions and how well that does early game. Kled, Poppy, and Kennen are all amazing early game frontliners, with Ziggs doing a decent amount of damage in the backline. Hellions also increase in value the higher star level you have, so they make for an easy reroll composition to learn for new players. Legionnaire is another carry trait that goes up and down in value depending on where Draven is in the meta. So far it's done well, as Draven, while not the most consistent of carries, is strong enough. Plus, late game, you can always swap to Kayle, who is quite devastating the longer the fight goes on. Renewer has a lot of early game value because of Vladimir and Lissandra. Those two pair well together, which is why we're seeing a few reroll compositions focus on them. Renewer also has late game value thanks to Ivern and Heimerdinger, though this trait isn't all that useful in the mid game. Next, we have Eternal. Playing Eternal means two things. One, you have Kindred, and Kindred is one of the best late game champions for any composition. Two is you get a free unit on your board, Wolf. Wolf isn't ridiculously strong, but that's made up for by the fact that you gain an extra unit on your board that doesn't count against your board size. So yeah, Eternal is great in the late game. And the last A tier trait is Revenant. We went back and forth on whether this trait deserved to be A tier, but we're leaving it in purely because of how well Ivern and Volibear synergize. Both provide much needed crowd control to your board and are difficult to kill thanks to Revenant. The trait is also useful for Nocturne, but Nocturne is rather niche at the moment. Alright, let's move on to the B tier. This tier consists of Abomination, Skirmisher, Dawnbringer, Brawler, Coven, Assassin, Caretaker, Mystic, and Revenant. Overall, these traits can do well, but have a diminished presence in the meta compared to the tiers above them. At the top of B tier, we have Abomination. Abomination was S tier for a long time until they nerfed it several times, including removing the first tier of the trait. Now it's not as easy to run Abomination early game as you need Nunu. Still, the monstrosity can be difficult to deal with during stage 3 and 4, so Abomination is not doing poorly. It's just been nerfed enough times that we're not entirely sure if it deserves a higher placing in the tier list. Next is Skirmisher. Skirmisher is a carry trait with inconsistent carries. Nidalee used to be overpowered, now she's in the middle of the pack in terms of strength. Jax is usually what players run as their carry, but being melee, he's difficult to use and often gets outscaled by ranged carries. Skirmisher certainly has a place in the meta, but it's not quite up to par with Ranger or Legionnaire. Dawnbringer struggles because past the early game, the only units that really matter for this trait are Karma and Garen. Nidalee's been nerfed too many times and Riven has yet to shine as a carry, so all of the weight of this trait is on those two late game champions. Both of which are strong, but at that point of the game, you're really not often running many Dawnbringers, so they won't be healing that much. Brawler is back in set 5, except there's only 2 tiers and 5 champions. So the value of this trait as a frontline starts off strong in the early game and falls off hard after that. Volibear does save this trait a bit late game, but overall Brawler is one of the weaker frontline options past stage 2. Coven is an odd spot because if you get it early enough with Morgana, it has a lot of value. And there's plenty of ways to make the trait work. The difficulty is that you need 3 champions to make a Coven leader, and 2 of those lose value the later the game goes on. Coven also struggles in the late game because positioning around the Coven leader buff is difficult and easily punished by other players. The good trait, just a bit clunky at the moment to use. Several assassins are doing well, particularly Diana with her utility, but the trait, beyond the jump at the beginning of combat, doesn't matter all that much unless you're running a niche Nocturne carry comp. They tweak more of the numbers, we may see Assassin go up in value, but for now it's mostly just a tool for Diana and Viego to get into the backline. Caretaker is interesting in design, but in practical use, it falters. The issue is that Heimerdinger's value is tied to the baby dragon. On his own, he really doesn't do anything, so if the baby dragon dies, he has to waste a cast to bring it back. And the targeting of the baby dragon is not that reliable, so it's not uncommon to see 2 units do almost nothing in a fight, which is awkward since Heimer is a 5-cost unit. We all know Mystic can be a useful splash trait. At the moment, it depends a lot on what other players are running, though Kindred and Morgana are always worth splashing in for their utility. But nothing is new with Mystic, with its value dependent upon the meta. Lastly, for B tier, we have Verdant. Verdant can be good because Taric is used so often, so some builds can easily access the trait because of Ashe or if someone is running a late game Kayle. But the trait doesn't provide that long of crowd control immunity for 2, and running 3 of the trait is quite awkward. There's not enough CC in set 5 for Verdant to have a lot of inherent value yet. Let's now move on to the last tier for today, the C tier. This tier consists of Draconic, Dragonslayer, Spellweaver, and Cruel. These traits are useful in the right situation, but lack the same impact the other traits provide. First up is Draconic. Draconic can carry you pretty well if you manage to find the Draconic units early enough. The issue is that Draconic units really don't scale well unless you're 3-starring them, and Heimerdinger isn't all that strong late game for now, so it's useful in niche situations, specifically in the early game. Dragonslayer provides bonus ability power to its champions, which is great, but it doesn't really make that big of a difference. 3 of the units are frontliners, with Mordekaiser doing alright damage and Diana used for her utility, not as a carry. So there's not a lot of damage coming out of this trait to consistently make the second part of it proc. But we don't want to undersell Mordekaiser and Diana, as both of them are quite good. Spellweaver is, quite frankly, boring. All it does is add a bit of ability power to only Spellweaver champions. And sure, that bonus can be a decent amount, but they gain nothing else. The other issue is that Vel'Koz with maybe Zyra are the only 2 champions that you're likely to run from this trait in the late game, so you're not going to get a lot of value from the increased ability power. Hopefully, they can tweak this trait in the future. And the last trait for our tier list today is Cruel. Cruel is a great design to have a champion be purchasable with your health. The problem is this comes far too late in the game, where using Teemo is a gamble if you're not high rolling, so you can never plan around having Teemo on your board. For the second aspect of Cruel, where Teemo wins a round if there's only 1 enemy left, well, it's cool, but kind of gimmicky. Overall, this trait would have been a lot better if Teemo was a weaker unit so they could lower his cost. And that's all we have for today's tier list video, folks. As we said, this is just a first look of where the meta looks to be going for set 5 traits. Expect this to change a lot after the set fully releases on the 28th, or at least when they slow down the amount of changes on the PvE. Let us know which trait you think is the best so far in set 5. Thank you for watching, and if you're enjoying our content, be sure to hit the like button and subscribe for future Giant Slayer TFT videos.